I think that the idea that it's all in the brain is an unnecessary limitation. Materialist thinking about the brain is extraordinarily local. It localizes all these things actually inside the head. But within the sciences, since the 19th century, we now have a much broader view of matter and the way that nature is organized. And this is broadened through the concept of fields. Electrical and magnetic fields also stretch out beyond physical objects. A magnetic field stretches out far beyond the magnet. You can reveal its lines of force through sprinkling iron filings around it, but the field itself is invisible. And the electromagnetic fields of your mobile telephone are within the mobile telephone, but stretch invisibly beyond it. This room is full of radio transmissions from mobile phones, from radio and television programs. The world is full of invisible fields. This is a revelation of 19th and 20th century science, which I don't think has been taken on board by people thinking about materialist theories of the brain. And what I'd like to suggest is that our fields of our minds stretch out far beyond our bodies. They stretch out invisibly, and our consciousness is related to and based on these fields. That if we're going to solve the hard problem, taking into account fields of the mind may be a very important ingredient, as well as studying processes within the brain. The easiest way to see what I'm talking about is indeed through vision. What's going on when you see something? Well, everybody knows that light comes into the eyes. Ever since Johann Kepler in 1604 worked out that there were inverted images on the retina, we know that the lens focuses the light in each eye. You have a small inverted image on your retina. Changes happen in the cone cells and the rod cells. Impulses travel up the optic nerve. Changes happen in various regions of the brain. All this has been mapped and scanned in greater detail than ever before. But the mysterious part is then what happens next. How do you create images, three-dimensional, full-color images? They're all supposed to be inside your head, representations of the outer world. So I can see you sitting there, you can see me here, but all of you are supposed to be inside my head, as lots of faces and the whole of this room is meant to be. And inside your head is supposed to be a little Rupert, somewhere inside your brain. That's not what we actually experience. What we actually experience is that our images are out there. Your image of me, I'm imagining, is where I'm actually standing right now, and my image of you is where you are. So this one-way theory of vision, which we've all grown up with, which comes from Kepler, the intromission theory of vision, sending in intromission, is taken to be the standard scientific view. But there's another and older theory of vision, the extramission theory, that says not only does light come in, but the images we see are projected out. So my images of you are where they seem to be. They're in my mind, they're in my consciousness, but they're not inside my head. They're where you're sitting. Now, this idea is familiar to the ancient Greeks. It's familiar to people all over the world. The developmental psychologist Jean Piaget showed that young European children, in his book The Child's Conception of the World, think that they're projecting out images, that they take it for granted. So this is in fact a very deep-seated way of thinking about vision. And Euclid, the great geometer, used it to explain in the first really clear way how mirrors work. What happens when you look at something in a mirror is the light is reflected from the mirror. The angle of incidence, the angle of reflection are the same. But what happens then is you project out the images, which go straight through the mirror, being virtual, mental projections, and you see virtual images behind the mirror. And Euclid's theory is still there in school textbooks to explain mirrors. All of you, no doubt, have seen these diagrams. They involve little dotted lines behind the mirror that go to what's called a virtual image behind the mirror, a projection of the mind behind the mirror. And so this extramission, a sending out theory of vision, is actually taught to all school children, even though within most of science it's regarded as a total heresy. Intromission is the only permissible theory in biology and psychology, whereas in optics, which comes under physics, extromission is the standard theory. But no wonder it's confusing. People are taught two completely different theories of vision. At Ohio State University, Gerald Weiner, who's a professor of psychology, was shocked to find that most adults and children he interviewed believed in visual extromission, something going out of the eyes. Even his own psychology undergraduates believed it. So he called this a fundamental misunderstanding of visual perception, and he decided to re-educate them. And he and his colleagues told them forcefully over and over again, nothing goes out of the eyes when you look at something. And after repeated drilling with this into the students, when they were tested immediately after this denial of extromission teaching, they gave the correct answers. But when they tested them 3 to 5 months later, almost all of them had reverted to their previous views. They were dismayed at this failure of scientific education. Much more recently, in fact just in the last few years, Arvid Gutterstam, working first at Princeton University, now at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, has shown that by some very ingenious experiments that people attribute a gentle force to the gaze as it goes out of the eyes. And they've even shown, using fMRI, that regions of the brain involved in tracking movement are activated. And as he puts it, the results, this is a quote, strongly suggest that when people view a face looking at an object, the brain treats that gaze as if a movement were present, passing from the face to the object. And they found that this occurred even in people who didn't believe in visual extromission. It's deep, hardwired in the way we see. And they tried to explain this by saying there must be an evolutionary reason for it, that it's important to track people's gaze in social situations, and this leads to the illusion that something's going out of the eyes when you look at things. It would make much better sense in evolutionary terms if it's not an illusion, but if it's real. And so is it real? Well, you're not meant to think it's real because that goes against the dogma that the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain and the perceptions are inside the head. But is it testable? Well, I think it is. If when I look at you as a projection from my mind that touches you, my mind in a sense reaches out to touch you, if I look at you from behind and you don't know I'm there, could you feel that I'm looking at you? Well, as soon as you ask that question, you realize that the sense of being stared at is very common. It's now called Scopaesthesia, the scientific name for it. Scop as in microscope, seeing, aesthesia, feeling, as in synesthesia, anesthesia. Scopaesthesia is extremely common. Most people have experienced it. I'm sure most people in this room have experienced it. You turn around, you find someone's looking at you, or you stare at someone and they turn around and look back. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's very common. Most people have experienced it, including most children. It's usually directional. You turn and look straight at the person. You don't just feel uneasy and search around. I have a recent paper on directional scopaesthesia showing that on the basis of 960 case studies, the directionality is just a basic feature of this and the way people experience it. I've investigated the natural history. We've interviewed, dealt with through questionnaires. We found it typically happens most powerfully with strangers, often with male strangers in situations that could be vaguely threatening. We've done interviews with more than 50 surveillance officers, celebrity photographers, and private detectives, practically all of whom just take this for granted. If you've ever trained to be a private detective, and I'm guessing that most of you haven't, you will have learned that when you're following someone, shadowing somebody, you don't stare at their back, because if you do, they'll turn around, catch your eyes, and your cover's blown. You have to look at them a little bit, otherwise you lose them, but you look at their feet. So among practical people, these things are completely taken for granted. In the martial arts, it's taken for granted, and they have methods of training people to become more sensitive. Because if you can feel when someone's approaching from behind who might attack you, you'll survive better than if you didn't feel it. They train this ability, people get better at it. Well, many experiments have already been done on the sense of being stared at. They've been done in at least 37 different schools and colleges, have been replicated in many parts of the world. The statistical significance is astronomical. At the Nemo Science Museum in Amsterdam, an experiment on the sense of being stared at was running for more than 20 years. More than 20,000 people took part. It was called Have You Got Eyes in the Back of Your Head? And people had to guess whether they were being looked at or not in a randomized sequence of trials. The results were astronomically significant statistically. I mean, I didn't run this experiment myself. It was run by the Dutch Museum. The results were analyzed by Dutch statisticians, and it showed a massively significant effect. The most sensitive subjects, incidentally, were children under the age of 9. So here we have something which is extremely well known. It's well known all over the world. The scientific evidence suggests it really happens. The scientific teaching of how mirrors work assumes that there's an extramission of influences. It seems to be deeply seated in biology. It happens with animals. Animals can tell when they're being looked at, and people can tell when animals are looking at them. So here we have a very, very well-known phenomenon, very deep-seated biologically. Many different species of animals have shown this ability. I think it's evolved in the context of predator-prey relationships. A prey animal that could tell when a predator was looking at it, a hidden predator was looking at it, would survive better than one that didn't. And I think it has enormous implications for our understanding of the mind. Because if our minds are not just about what happens in brains, and if our conscious experience is extended through electromagnetic fields, which is what light is, it suggests that minds have an interface with electromagnetism. We know they do in the brain. A lot of brain activity that correlates with consciousness is electromagnetic activity. There seems to be an interface between electromagnetism and consciousness, and why it should be confined to the inside of the head is a purely arbitrary assumption. It comes from René Descartes originally, I suppose, or from the ancient Greek materialists, but Descartes made a division between extended things, res extensa, matter, is extended in space, whereas mind, res cogitans, was not extended in space. It was defined by being unextended. So the idea was the mind was unextended but interacted with the brain somewhere inside the head. So I'm suggesting that actually when we let go of that assumption, which has been so limiting for so long, we can broaden our view of the mind and go further than we've gone so far in a way that will help solve the real problems leading towards the hard problem. Finally, I just want to say that I think the extended mind doesn't just extend out into the world, it extends throughout the body. When someone has, say, a phantom limb after an amputation, I think that that phantom limb is part of the extended mind, and that people feel the limb to be really there. And I think what they're doing is projecting that image of the limb and feeling it from within as to where the limb actually is. The official view is it's all inside the brain, but I don't think it is. And so I think once we liberate the mind from the brain more generally and consciousness from the brain more particularly, we have a much wider context for discussing this knotty problem, the hard problem of the relation between mind and brain. When we take into account the extended mind, instead of just arbitrarily confining it to the inside of the head, we're much more likely to make progress in understanding how minds are related to our bodies and to the physical fields through which we see and through which we have our experiences. Thank you.